Hello everyone, it's Martin, aka Anders, and in today's Computing Competitive, we're going to be tackling the MandatoryGG Cup Ignition Series event that just happened in Europe. Let's get right into it. This event, hosted by French organization MandatoryGG, used a fairly unique format that we hadn't seen put into place in any other Ignition Series event thus far. It kicked off with a 128-team open bracket. Matches were played as best of ones all the way up to the quarterfinal and had their maps predetermined. In the round of 64, you saw Bind. In the round of 32, we had Split. In the round of 16, we had Haven, and in the quarterfinals, we saw Ascent. The competition overall was quite bittersweet for those of us who have been following the EU scene closely. It was the swan song for a number of high-caliber teams that we've all come to love, like Fabriken. Compounding that heartbreak even further, Fabriken didn't make it out of even the round of 32. The only bright side to this was that it left room for some newer teams to show their mettle and prove that they can rise through the ranks and fill the void that's left behind by some of these other high caliber teams that have disbanded in the recent past. And now we get into the spoilers. Two of those newer teams did exactly that and showed up massively on the day. BBL Esports, a Turkish dark horse that was recently signed with CNED Aslan amongst others, made it all the way to the semi-final before being knocked out by G2. And the new banner carriers for the Swedish community, Bonk, made it all the way through to the grand final, knocking out NiP in their semi. The grand final was shaping up to be one of the best sets that Europe has seen thus far, pitting G2, who I consider the best mechanical team in Europe, against Bonk, who I've begun to credit as being one of, if not the outright best strategic team in Europe. The result, however, came out pretty one-sided, at least on paper, with G2 taking the set 3-0. Bonk, however, gave them anything but an easy time, going tit for tat on Haven and Ascent, and only beginning to slide a bit on the third map of Bind. This set represented a really important shift in the EU scene in general, where we have these more cerebral rosters like Bonk pushing even the undefeated dream team of G2. That's enough of the general information of the tournament though, let's hop right into the stats. Unlike what I usually do, where I'd be going into map information at this point, unfortunately I'm going to have to jump over it for this tournament. As I mentioned, there was a pre-configured map format, and because of that, map samples in general were grossly skewed, and so I'm going to jump directly into agent statistics instead. Kicking us off with those agent statistics, we see a pretty dramatic shift in what's being played in Europe. Right at the top we have Cypher, who's dethroned Sage as the recurring most played agent in tournament level play. I've long considered Cypher and Sentinels as an archetype in general incredibly powerful. I've argued on multiple occasions that Cypher's the strongest agent in the game, and this pick rate is beginning to rapidly reflect that. And Morello recently said during one of his streams that after Breach and Sage buffs come through, Cypher is very likely next on the table for some major changes. Right below him, we have the most versatile controller in the game in Omen, now up to an almost 90% pick rate in the European scene. If you've been following me for a long time, you know that I don't need to explain anything more than I already have when it comes to Omen. It's really nice to see him finally at the level that I've expected out of him so long. Next on the list we have Sage, who's fallen a bit out of favor as teams have become more willing to try Sageless compositions. I think that's a really healthy shift in the way that the game's strategy is developing, but I don't expect we'll see her dip much further below this, not at least until we see alternative agents that fill a similar strategic niche introduced to the game. I expect we'll see her in the high 70s, low 80s for a long time to come. After her, we have Sova, who made a major jump in the rankings. Now up to an almost 80% pick rate, I think people are starting to understand that Sova as an agent and information gathering in general is absolutely ludicrous in this game. We'll see match after match and time after time that the wall hack that Sova's abilities gives access to makes operators even more terrifying than they already are, and leads to a lot of opportunity for cheesy, sort of free, low-risk picks. And that incredible ability to facilitate picks for the rest of his team is what's driving this pick rate. Next up, we have Jett at an almost 71% pick rate, really becoming the go-to operator user for the majority of competitive teams. Below her, we have Raze. Raze is surprisingly falling a bit out of favor in Europe, which I wouldn't typically expect. When we get to compositions, this will become a little bit easier to explain, and so I'll sort of put a pin in it for now. This next one is super similar, where we see Breach, which historically is Europe's favorite entry fragger and flash user, drops to a sub 15% pick rate. Again, this is very clearly explained once we get to compositions. Below him, we have Brimstone, who is now very firmly a worse controller than Omen in the eyes of Europe, and his pick rate absolutely shows it, dropping all the way to 11%. With him at 11% is Phoenix. This pick rate borders on hilarious just because of how extreme it is compared to North America. If we look at the weekend as a whole, we had the MandatoryGG Cup, but then in North America, we also had a non-Ignition Series event, but still an incredibly high-profile one that I actually had the pleasure of shoutcasting, where we saw all the top teams, TSM, Sentinels, etc. duking it out. In that competition, Phoenix had a 55% pick rate. We see 11 in EU and 55 in NA. It tells a really interesting story, and I think that story is highlighted by how prevalent Omen is in EU, that EU is deciding to answer operators primarily through smokes, and NA is deciding to answer it primarily through flashes. Below Phoenix, we have Reyna, and I'm going to be completely blunt. Reyna almost isn't even worth talking about when we're looking at tournament Valorant. I feel like if you're picking her, you're basically telling your opponents that I have the ego and confidence to say that I don't even really need functional utility to beat you. It's just a flex. And below her, for yet another competition, we didn't see any Viper. At this point, I don't know what it's going to take for teams to actually start picking up Viper. We've already seen a round of frankly over-the-top buffs, and Morello has mentioned a high likelihood of even more buffs. You'd think that with EU's leanings into using controllers and smokes to answer operators, they would have a natural inclination to picking this up, but we still haven't seen it come through yet. I'm at a loss on this one. And that'll toss us over to agent win rates. Win rates are going to be a bit of another mixed bag, and confusingly, at the top of the food chain with just over 52%, we have Phoenix. I was a bit perplexed by this, so I dove into it a tad more, and you may remember Phoenix only saw an 11% play rate. Well, around half of that was Bonk, and Bonk was obviously slapping people with it all the way to the grand final. So this 52%, while it is the top of the board, is really Bonk's 52%. Below Phoenix, we have Jett, which is a far more balanced statistic in my opinion. Jett was played by the majority of teams throughout the tournament, and this 52% is very impressive when you take that into consideration. Below Jett, we have Omen, who follows a very similar line of reasoning, but even more extreme. Omen saw an almost 90% play rate. For him to have a 52% win rate, even with that overwhelming play rate, means that his non-duplication, non-mirror win rate was almost flawless. If you played against a team that had Omen, and you didn't have Omen, you were basically assured to lose. Just for the kicks, I pulled up exactly that number, what Omenless teams had as their scoreline, and they were a total of 2 and 8. I guess the moral of the story here is that if you're playing in EU and you think you shouldn't play Omen, you better know damn well what you're doing. Below that, we have the typical high pick rate cluster with Sova, Cypher, and Sage, all just shy of the 50% mark. Below Sage, though, we run into Raze, who is underperforming in a very atypical fashion for EU. I think the key to this low win rate for an agent that EU is very typically successful on is driven by a far more major and region-wide shift in playstyle that I'll explain a bit more when we get to compositions. Below Raze, we have Reyna doing very poorly at a 43%, as we would expect out of her. Below even Reyna, we have Brimstone, who showed up incredibly poorly at only 37%. This is basically Brimstone being slapped around by Omen. There wasn't a super large sample of Brimstone being played, obviously, at only 11%, and when he was on the receiving end of an Omen comp, and he just didn't find his way through. Below him, and technically the last on our list, is Breach at just shy of 35%. I'm gonna be honest, I think that Breach is still probably the best flash using agent in the game right now if you don't count Omen as a flash user. But Breach is still incredibly poorly suited to the way that the metagame has evolved. The fact that his flashes are wall-bound and we're dealing with a meta where ops are finding more and more creative angles, you just need flash flexibility, and that is something that Breach most certainly doesn't bring to the table. If we were looking at a more rifle-driven metagame, I still think Breach would be near the top of the table. And it goes without saying that Viper, with her 0% play rate, doesn't have win rate stats. Shocking, I know. With all of the agent stats out of the way, let's get right into compositions and a little bit of a talk about where I think EU has shifted and where I think they're going. We have here the top 3 most played compositions throughout the tournament, and if you think back just a moment, you won't be surprised to see a 4-piece core here. They were the 4 most played agents across the entire tournament, and some of you may have noticed, they're also the dark web. In my most recent computing competitive, I noted that I expected the dark web archetype of Cypher, Omen, Sage, and Sova to define the global meta moving forward. The MandatoryGG Cup proves that I couldn't have been more right. While only being in the 2 most played compositions in the event, dark web accounted for a total of over half of all games played. Not only that, but they were also far and away the most successful compositions of the tournament. Dark Web plus Jet finding a 56% win rate, Dark Web plus Raze finding an even-keeled 50% win rate, and the only one of these top 3 comps that wasn't Dark Web falling to an only 40%. Looking at the difference between those 2 Dark Web compositions in the 3rd comp, explaining why it found so little success is pretty easy. They decided not to bring Sova. And if you were listening earlier when I was talking about Sova, you know that that's really not an option at this point. We can take lessons from other games. If you look at something like Rainbow Six Siege, it started out as a largely mechanics-driven game, almost played like Call of Duty, where everyone was focusing on gun skill. Over time, though, people understood the depth of utility in that game and the overwhelming power of information. Valorant is finally following a similar path where information, and more specifically how you leverage information in action scenarios, is driving teams' ability to not only win, but run all the way to first place. We see G2, for example, taking Artis, a player known for his godlike mechanics, and putting him on Sova duty. That's not because they don't think he wouldn't be better served on a more frag-focused agent like an Entry or a Raze. It's because they're coming to terms with the fact that the intel that Sova can provide is a better frag enabler than tools that are traditionally considered frag enabling. Why would you focus on giving one of your star players a flash so that they can then peek a hallway, when instead you could just give them a Sova recon dart and have them shoot through the wall and never have to expose themselves? It gives longevity to these mechanical superstars so that they're not exposed until they're absolutely forced to, and they can make the best use of their clutch potential. The dark web has absolutely unequivocally become the top composition in European Valorant. So much so that if you weren't running a dark web composition, your win rate in this event was 47%. I will say this though, that I don't think that this should be the case. I know that I was the one who predicted this composition's rise, but that doesn't mean I agree with it. That means that I can predict what the player base's mentality will be and how their strategy will evolve. And frankly, I still think it's lagging. I think we're 3 steps behind where we should be right now, and that's how we landed on this. If you want a case study in that, look at Bonk. I claim that they're the best strategic team in Europe, and guess who was one of the only teams throughout this event to not run back-to-back-to-back dark web comps? This game doesn't, nor will it likely ever, support a one-size-fits-all approach to strategy. With that said though, I'm going to cut myself off there, because if I don't, I'm probably going to rant for another 10 minutes. As I've said a couple times now throughout this video, I think the MandatoryGG Cup was a pretty big hallmark shift in the way that EU was playing the game. We've seen in the past how we've played Shock and Awe, we've moved towards more information gathering, and are now leaning onto Dark Web. I'm eager to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comments below. Do you think it's healthy that these shifts are so predictable, and where do you think we're going from here? I'm personally a little bit concerned that we'll see a bit of a convergence between both regions. Right now, obviously, we have North America playing Phoenix, using his flashes out of smokes as a pretty potent answer to the operator, and in EU, we see more of an intel-driven controllery style in order to answer them. What happens if they combine and we just see Dark Web plus Phoenix every game in both regions? That will stalemate the strategic development of this game, and is something I hope no one wants to see. Would love to hear your guys' thoughts down below on what you think the potency of that sort of composition would be, and how you personally think the game is going to evolve. Obviously, we have Killjoy, who's coming onto the scene quite quickly, and hopefully that torpedoes things. I'm actually going to have a video coming out on my thoughts on Killjoy within the next day or two here, so stay tuned for that. Per the usual, I really appreciate you guys tuning in. Please drop a like and subscribe if you're enjoying my content. You also can catch me on Twitter, Instagram, and Twitch, all at AnderzzTV. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, in a new exciting development, you can also catch me casting some tournaments. I had the pleasure over the weekend of casting the 30 Bomb Summer Cup, and I'm very eager to get more casting gigs in the future, being able to share this kind of analysis with you guys live on broadcast. If you catch wind of any sort of event like that and you would love to see me on it, ping the people who are organizing the event, tag me, and I will definitely get in touch with them and see if we can't work something out. As always, greatly appreciate you guys tuning in, and I will see you in the next one.